power, corruption, justice. It all started with a routine arrest, or at least that's what Officer Brian Callahan wanted everyone to believe. A black woman standing quietly outside a building late at night. Suspicious behavior, he claimed. Resisting arrest, he reported. An open and shut case. But Gabrielle Monroe wasn't just any woman. And when the truth began to surface, the cracks in Callahan's story quickly spread, exposing not only his lies, but the dark network of protection behind him. A system built to shield men like him. A system Gabrielle knew all too well. The courtroom became a battlefield as Gabrielle faced off against Callahan and the very department meant to uphold the law. Lies were exposed. Testimonies were shattered. And just when Callahan thought he had one, Gabrielle revealed who she really was. The question wasn't whether Callahan was guilty. The question was how far the system would go to protect him. This is a story about power and accountability, about what happens when someone with nothing left to lose decides to fight back. If you're ready for a story packed with twists, betrayals, and a courtroom showdown that will leave you speechless, stay with me. And before we get started, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's begin. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of the Lincoln County Courthouse, casting delicate beams of amber and crimson across the polished wooden floors. The room hummed with quiet tension, a low undercurrent of murmurs from the gallery as spectators leaned toward each other, exchanging hushed theories about what would happen today. A row of reporters sat poised behind their notepads, pens tapping nervously against their paper. Some had cameras slung around their necks, ready to capture the moment that had already made headlines across the state. The gallery was packed. Activists, politicians, local townsfolk, all drawn by the promise of scandal. In a defendant's seat sat Gabrielle Monroe, a poised black woman in her early 40s. Her dark brown skin glowed under the dim courthouse lighting, and her tailored navy blue suit molded to her frame with an effortless elegance. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers interlocked. She was calm, too calm, for someone accused of obstruction of justice and assaulting a police officer. Her expression was smooth as polished marble, betraying nothing. But her eyes, sharp, calculating, missed nothing. She took in every detail. The slight crack in the wood of the judge's podium, the scuffed toe of the prosecutor's shoes, and the smug, predatory grin of the man seated across from her. Officer Brian Callahan. He leaned back in his chair at the prosecution's table, his polished badge catching the light. A tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp blue eyes and a square jawline, Callahan radiated the quiet confidence of someone who had always gotten away with things. His uniform was crisp, his tie neatly knotted, his smile condescending. He tapped a pen lightly against the table and exchanged a smirk with the assistant district attorney seated beside him. Ms. Monroe, Callahan's voice cut through the low chatter like a knife. I guess it's not so easy to talk your way out of this one, huh? Gabrielle's gaze slid toward him. Slowly, deliberately, she smiled. A small, measured curve of her lips that didn't touch her eyes. Funny, she said, her tone smooth as silk. I was about to say the same thing to you. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the bailiff's voice boomed across the room. All rise. Everyone stood as Judge Margaret Holloway swept into the room, her black robe flowing behind her. The judge's face was etched with years of experience, sharp eyes framed by steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her gaze swept over the courtroom before she settled into her high-backed leather chair. You may be seated, Judge Holloway instructed. As the crowd settled back into their seats, the assistant district attorney, a young man named Daniel Rourke, adjusted his tie and rose to speak. Your Honor, Rourke began, his tone clipped and professional. The state intends to prove that Ms. Monroe knowingly and unlawfully obstructed a police operation and used physical force against Officer Callahan in the course of his lawful duties. The evidence will show. Gabrielle stopped listening. Her eyes drifted back toward Callahan, whose smirk had widened. He leaned back lazily in his chair, as if he had already won. She had seen that look before. Years of handling discrimination cases, defending those who had been abused by the very system meant to protect them. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who had played the game before and never lost. Ms. Monroe, Gabrielle's gaze snapped toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, adjusting the cuff of her jacket as she rose. "If I may, I'd like to waive my right to an opening statement. I'd prefer to speak directly to the facts when the time comes." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The reporters' pens scratched furiously against their notepads. Even Judge Holloway's brow lifted slightly in surprise. "Very well," the judge said after a moment's pause. "Prosecution, call your first witness." Daniel Rourke stood. "The state calls Officer Brian Callahan to the stand." Callahan adjusted his uniform and strode confidently toward the stand. He moved with the cocky ease of a man who believed the world revolved around him. He swore in, settled into the witness chair, and flashed a self-satisfied grin toward the jury. "Officer Callahan," Rourke began, "could you describe the events of the night of September 14th? Callahan leaned forward, the practiced charm in his voice evident. "Of course. It was around 11:45 p.m. when I responded to a call about suspicious activity near the old warehouse on 3rd Street. I found Ms. Monroe loitering outside the building. When I approached her to question what she was doing there, she became hostile." Gabrielle's eyes narrowed. "And what do you mean by hostile?" Rourke pressed. "She raised her voice at me, refused to provide ID, and when I attempted to detain her," Callahan's smile widened, "she struck me across the chest and tried to reach for my weapon." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Gabrielle's expression didn't change, but inside, she felt the cold burn of controlled rage settle in her chest. "And you're certain it was Ms. Monroe who initiated the attack?" Rourke asked. "Absolutely." Gabrielle's attorney, Ethan Powell, leaned toward her. "Gabrielle," he whispered, "we should object. This is character assassination without evidence." "No," Gabrielle replied quietly. "Let him finish." Ethan gave her a hard look, but Gabrielle's gaze remained steady on Callahan. Callahan sat back, his eyes meeting hers with thinly veiled amusement. "She's lucky I didn't press more serious charges." The prosecutor's lips twitched with a hint of a smile. Gabrielle's gaze darkened. When Callahan stepped down from the stand and returned to his seat, Gabrielle rose. "Ms. Monroe," Judge Holloway said, "do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" Gabrielle stepped toward the center of the room. Her heels echoed across the hardwood floor. Every eye was on her as she approached the stand. "Officer Callahan." Gabrielle's voice was calm, measured, as if she were asking about the weather. "You said you found me loitering. Define loitering for the court." Callahan's brow furrowed. "Standing somewhere without a clear purpose." "Standing." Gabrielle arched an eyebrow. "So standing outside a public building is now considered loitering?" Callahan's jaw flexed. It was suspicious behavior. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "Suspicious because I was standing, or because I was black?" The gallery's tension thickened like a storm cloud. Callahan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Gabrielle smiled faintly. "No further questions." She turned and walked back to her seat, her gaze briefly meeting Callahan's. The amusement in his eyes had dimmed. Gabrielle sat down, steepling her fingers beneath her chin. Callahan thought he had already won. He had no idea how wrong he was. Tomorrow, she thought, the real game begins. Gabrielle sat at the defense table, her hands folded neatly on the polished wood surface. The tension in the courtroom had settled into a low hum, an invisible pressure that pulsed beneath the whispers and rustling of papers. Officer Callahan sat at the prosecution's table, leaning back in his chair like a king surveying his domain. His smirk remained, but Gabrielle could see the thin line of tension forming at the corner of his mouth. He was confident, but he wasn't invincible. She had seen men like him before, men who believed the badge on their chest gave them immunity from consequences, men who mistook their authority for righteousness. Judge Holloway's gavel struck the wood. "Prosecution, call your next witness," the judge instructed. Assistant District Attorney Rourke rose smoothly. His hair was neatly combed, and his crisp charcoal suit gave him the air of a man who had everything under control. The state calls Sergeant Michael Lawson. A broad-shouldered officer with sandy blonde hair and a square jaw approached the stand. He wore his uniform like armor, starched and spotless, and his walk was practiced and steady. He swore in, his gaze briefly cutting toward Callahan as if looking for approval. "Sergeant Lawson," Rourke began, "were you on duty the night of September 14th? "Yes, sir." "And did you witness Officer Callahan's encounter with Ms. Monroe?" Lawson's jaw tightened. "I arrived after the arrest had been made. I was called to the scene as backup." "And what did you see when you arrived?" Lawson's gaze flicked toward Callahan, then back toward Rourke. Officer Callahan had Ms. Monroe in custody. She was in handcuffs, and she was being placed in the back of the patrol car. "Did Ms. Monroe appear to be injured?" Lawson hesitated. His eyes darted toward Callahan for the briefest moment. "No," Lawson said finally. "She seemed calm." Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "Interesting. Did Officer Callahan say anything to you about the arrest?" Rourke pressed. Lawson's hesitation was almost imperceptible, a flicker of tension in his jaw. He said Ms. Monroe had been aggressive, that she struck him and attempted to take his weapon. "And you believed him?" "Yes," Lawson said. Rourke nodded, as if the case was already won. "Thank you, Sergeant Lawson," Rourke said. "No further questions." Gabrielle stood. "Sergeant Lawson," she said smoothly, walking toward the stand. "You mentioned that you arrived after the arrest, correct?" "Yes." "Did you see Ms. Monroe commit any act of aggression toward Officer Callahan?" Lawson's brows pulled together. "No, but did you see her reach for his weapon?" "No." "Did you see any injuries on Officer Callahan?" Lawson hesitated. "No." Gabrielle's lips curved faintly. "And yet, you believed Officer Callahan's version of events?" Lawson's gaze flicked toward Callahan again, a subtle gesture, but Gabrielle caught it. Callahan's jaw was tight. "Officer Callahan is a trusted member of the department," Lawson said, though his tone wasn't as steady as before. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "Sergeant Lawson, do you know how many excessive force complaints have been filed against Officer Callahan?" Lawson stiffened. I wouldn't know." "I do." Gabrielle turned toward the gallery. 12 complaints in the last 3 years. A ripple of murmurs spread through the spectators. Gabrielle's eyes darkened. "And how many were investigated?" Lawson's throat bobbed. "None." Gabrielle stepped closer to the stand. "Why not?" Lawson's eyes darted toward Callahan. Callahan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "There wasn't enough evidence," Lawson said weakly. "Or maybe there wasn't enough, Will," Gabrielle said coldly. Rourke stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Holloway said, her eyes narrowing at Gabrielle. "Careful, Ms. Monroe." Gabrielle inclined her head in respect, but the damage was already done. The jury was watching, listening. "No further questions," Gabrielle said smoothly, turning away from the stand. Lawson rose quickly and walked toward the prosecution's table, his face flushed. Callahan's eyes followed him, but he didn't speak. Gabrielle sat down. Ethan leaned toward her. "You're stirring the pot," he whispered. "I'm not stirring it," Gabrielle replied. "I'm letting them taste it." Ethan's lips twitched. "Prosecution, your next witness," Judge Holloway said. Rourke stood. "The state calls Chief Matthew Conrad." The courtroom doors opened, and a tall man in his 50s entered. He wore a dark blue uniform with gold stripes down the sleeves, and the insignia of the Lincoln Police Department gleamed on his chest. Conrad's eyes were cold as steel as he took the stand. He swore in, sitting stiffly in the chair. "Chief Conrad," Rourke began, "you've known Officer Callahan for how long?" 8 years, Conrad said. "And in those 8 years, have you ever known him to use excessive force?" "No." Gabrielle's eyes narrowed. "And you stand by his actions on the night of September 14th?" "I do," Conrad said. Gabrielle stood. "Chief Conrad," she said, her tone calm. "Do you have access to Officer Callahan's personnel file?" "Yes." "Did you personally review the excessive force complaints?" "I reviewed them." "And you dismissed them?" "They were unsubstantiated," Conrad said coolly. Gabrielle smiled faintly. "Interesting. The complaints were filed by whom? Conrad's lips pressed together. Various individuals. Names. Ms. Monroe. Names, Gabrielle repeated. Conrad's gaze flicked toward Callahan. Judge Holloway sighed. Answer the question, Chief. Conrad's jaw flexed. Kevin Marshall. Stephen Tucker. Damon Wells. Gabrielle's gaze darkened. All African-American men, she said. The courtroom's silence was deafening. Conrad's eyes hardened. I don't see how that's relevant. Gabrielle smiled. Of course you don't. She turned toward the jury. 12 complaints, all filed by men of color, all dismissed without investigation. And the man responsible for those complaints is the same officer accusing me of assault. Conrad's face remained impassive, but Gabrielle saw the flicker of tension in his jaw. No further questions, Gabrielle said. Conrad stood stiffly and walked toward the exit. As he passed Callahan, Callahan's eyes narrowed slightly. A silent message passed between them. Gabrielle watched them both carefully. She had seen this before. Loyalty. Corruption. Power protecting power. But that loyalty was starting to crack. As Judge Holloway called for a recess, Gabrielle stood and smoothed her jacket. Ethan leaned toward her. They're tightening ranks, he said. Gabrielle's gaze slid toward Callahan, who was speaking quietly with Rourke. They should, she replied. Because after tomorrow, her eyes darkened. There won't be anywhere left to hide. The heavy oak doors of the Lincoln County Courthouse slammed shut behind Gabrielle Monroe as she walked into the hallway. A low murmur followed in her wake. Voices of curious reporters and spectators whispering theories and questions to one another. Gabrielle didn't slow. Her heels clicked steadily against the marble floors as she approached the defense table. Her gaze was sharp and cold, the weight of the previous testimonies swirling in her mind. Sergeant Lawson's nervous glances toward Callahan. Chief Conrad's clipped responses. The unspoken tension between them. A well-maintained machine was unraveling, slowly, piece by piece. Gabrielle could feel it. Ethan Powell stood beside her, flipping through his notes. He glanced toward her, his dark brows drawn together. You're getting under their skin, he said quietly. Gabrielle's lips curled into a faint smile. Good. That's the point. Ethan lowered his voice. But you're also giving them time to regroup. If they think you're about to take this further, they might tighten ranks. I know, Gabrielle replied calmly. But this isn't about them. Ethan's brow lifted. No. Gabrielle's gaze slid toward Officer Callahan, who sat at the prosecution's table with that smug, predatory grin still firmly in place. His polished badge gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. He's convinced this is just another game, Gabrielle said softly. He's counting on the system to protect him. Is he wrong? Gabrielle's smile sharpened. Let's find out. The courtroom doors opened once more, and the bailiff's voice boomed through the room. All rise. Judge Holloway swept back into the room, her expression severe beneath the weight of her black robe. She lowered herself into the judge's chair and gave a curt nod. Proceed. Daniel Rourke, the assistant district attorney, stood and straightened his tie. His expression was cooler now, more focused. Gabrielle had shaken him, but not enough to break him. Not yet. The prosecution calls Officer Callahan back to the stand. Callahan's smirk widened. He rose smoothly, his uniform crisp, his movements confident. He swore in and sat down, spreading his hands casually on his knees. Officer Callahan, Rourke began, for the sake of clarity, could you explain, once again, what happened the night you arrested Ms. Monroe? Of course, Callahan replied, his tone smooth. I was responding to a call about suspicious activity near 3rd Street. I approached Ms. Monroe to ask her why she was loitering outside a closed business. And what happened next? Callahan's smile thinned. She became defensive, aggressive. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. And when you attempted to question her, Rourke prompted. Callahan's jaw flexed. She refused to cooperate and reached for my weapon. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. And you're sure of this? Yes, Callahan said. Absolutely. Gabrielle stood. Your Honor, she said smoothly. Permission to cross-examine? Judge Holloway's gaze narrowed slightly. Proceed. Gabrielle walked toward the stand. Her heels echoed against the polished floor. Callahan's eyes followed her as she approached, curious, amused. She stopped directly in front of him. "Officer Callahan," Gabrielle began, her voice calm and steady. "You mentioned that you responded to a call about suspicious activity near 3rd Street. Yes. And who placed that call?" Callahan's brow twitched. "It was anonymous." Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "Anonymous?" "Yes." She arched an eyebrow. "Was the caller male or female?" Callahan hesitated. "Male." Gabrielle smiled faintly. "So it wasn't entirely anonymous." Callahan's eyes narrowed. "Did you record the call?" "No." Gabrielle's lips curved slightly. "Convenient." Rourke stood. "Objection. Overruled," Judge Holloway said without looking up. Gabrielle stepped closer to the stand. Callahan's expression remained carefully neutral, but Gabrielle saw the thin sheen of sweat forming at his temple. "You stated earlier that Ms. Monroe struck you and reached for your weapon," Gabrielle said. "Yes." Gabrielle's gaze darkened. "And yet, when you brought her in, there were no reports of bruising or injury to your person." Callahan's jaw tensed. "It happened quickly." Gabrielle tilted her head. "So quickly that there were no marks?" Callahan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Gabrielle's voice sharpened. "And your body cam?" "Malfunctioned." Gabrielle's gaze hardened. "Right. Just like the 12 other times it's malfunctioned during similar incidents involving black suspects." A ripple of murmurs surged through the courtroom. Callahan's gaze darkened. "Are you accusing me of misconduct?" "I don't need to accuse you of anything," Gabrielle said coldly. "The facts speak for themselves." Judge Holloway rapped her gavel. "Order." Gabrielle's gaze never left Callahan's. "Did you search me?" she asked. Callahan's eyes flicked toward Rourke. "Yes," he said tightly. "Did you find a weapon?" "No." "Did you find drugs?" "No." "Did you find anything illegal?" "No." Gabrielle's lips curled. "And yet you claimed I was a threat." Callahan's jaw clenched. "Yes." Gabrielle stepped back. "Interesting." She turned toward the jury. 12 complaints, Gabrielle said. 12 complaints of excessive force and racial bias. All dismissed. All involving suspects of color. Callahan's jaw flexed. Gabrielle turned back toward him. "Officer Callahan, what do you see when you look at me?" Callahan's gaze sharpened. "What?" Gabrielle's tone was soft now, dangerous. "What do you see?" she repeated. Callahan's lips twisted. "An uncooperative suspect." Gabrielle smiled faintly. "And that's why you arrested me?" "Yes." "And why you claimed I assaulted you?" Callahan's gaze hardened. "Yes." Gabrielle's smile sharpened. "That's funny," she said softly. "Because I wasn't under arrest when you pinned me to the hood of your patrol car, and yet you were already putting me in handcuffs." Callahan's eyes narrowed. "I'd say that means you weren't acting in response to a threat," Gabrielle continued. "You were acting out of fear." Callahan's jaw tightened. Gabrielle turned toward the judge. "No further questions." She walked back toward the defense table, her heels clicking against the floor. Callahan's gaze followed her, no longer amused. He was angry now. "Good." Ethan leaned toward her. "You're pushing him." "I'm not pushing him," Gabrielle murmured. "I'm setting the trap." Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened toward the prosecution's table. "Next witness." Rourke hesitated. His eyes slid toward Callahan, whose knuckles were white on the edge of the table. "The prosecution." Rourke's jaw tightened. "Rests." Gabrielle smiled faintly. "Game on." As the judge called for recess, Gabrielle stood and smoothed the front of her jacket. Callahan's gaze followed her as she walked toward the doors. Gabrielle didn't look back. She knew the storm was coming, and she was ready for it. Gabrielle stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, the cold morning air brushing against her face. The gray sky above was heavy with the threat of rain, clouds pressing low and thick. Behind her, the tall pillars of the Lincoln County Courthouse loomed like sentinels. A small crowd had already begun to gather at the bottom of the steps, reporters clutching microphones, photographers adjusting their lenses, and a handful of curious spectators waiting for any scrap of drama. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the murmurs beneath the steady hum of the city's early traffic. She's finished. They've got her. She's going to lose. Gabrielle's mouth curved into a small, hard smile. They have no idea. You realize you just threw gasoline on a bonfire, right? Ethan's voice came from behind her. He stepped down onto the marble step beside her, his expression tight with concern. His tie was slightly crooked, rare for someone as obsessively put together as Ethan. Gabrielle glanced sideways at him. "If you're nervous," she said, "you're welcome to step aside." Ethan's brow creased. "You think I'm nervous?" "You've had your hand in your pocket for the last 5 minutes," Gabrielle said lightly. "That's your tell." Ethan's lips thinned. He pulled his hand from his pocket and crossed his arms. "I'm not nervous." Gabrielle turned to face him fully. "Good, because we're about to make the next move." Ethan's gaze darkened. "Are you sure about this? If you push too hard, you could give them an opening." Gabrielle's smile sharpened. "Or I could push them off the edge." Before Ethan could reply, the courthouse doors opened behind them. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the marble foyer. Officer Brian Callahan appeared at the top of the steps. He was no longer smirking. His gaze was hard and cold, his mouth a thin line of quiet fury. His uniform was immaculate, his badge polished to a mirror sheen. But Gabrielle could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. He was unraveling. Callahan's gaze met hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crowd below the steps had gone quiet, waiting for something to break the tension. "You think you've got me," Callahan said quietly. Gabrielle's smile didn't fade. "I don't think. You've got no proof," Callahan murmured. His tone was low, lethal. "All you've got are theories and coincidence." Gabrielle's smile sharpened. "You sound worried." Callahan's gaze darkened. "Careful, Monroe. You think you can intimidate me?" Gabrielle said, her tone soft and dangerous. "Try harder." Callahan's lips twitched. He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know who you're playing with," he said. Gabrielle's gaze didn't waver. "Actually, Brian, I know exactly who I'm playing with." Callahan's jaw flexed. "You'll regret this," he said coldly. Gabrielle stepped toward him, close enough that she could see the tension beneath his skin, the slight rise and fall of his chest as his breathing quickened. "No," she said quietly. "You will." Without another word, Gabrielle turned and walked down the steps, her heels clicking against the marble. Ethan followed, his expression carefully guarded. "What are you doing?" Ethan hissed under his breath. "Poking the bear," Gabrielle replied. Ethan glanced behind them. "You sure that's smart?" Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "You ever seen a bear caught in a trap?" Ethan exhaled. "They get dangerous." Gabrielle's smile was razor sharp. "Exactly." Back inside the courthouse, the tension was thick as Judge Holloway returned to her seat. The gallery was full, reporters scribbling furiously, spectators leaning forward in their seats. "Defense, your next witness?" Judge Holloway said. Gabrielle stood smoothly. "I'd like to call Officer Heather Mallory to the stand." Mallory's head snapped up from the gallery. She was young, no more than 26, with short brown hair and pale blue eyes. She wore her uniform neatly pressed, her name tag shining beneath the overhead lights. A thin line of tension appeared between her brows as she walked toward the stand and swore in. Gabrielle approached slowly. "Officer Mallory," Gabrielle said, her tone calm. "You were present at the Lincoln Police Department the night Officer Callahan brought me in?" Mallory's jaw tensed. "Yes." "And you assisted in processing me?" "Yes." Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "Did you see any injuries on Officer Callahan?" Mallory hesitated. "No." "Did you hear him say that I attacked him?" Mallory's gaze flicked toward Callahan, a quick, almost instinctive movement. "Yes," she said carefully. "And you believed him?" Mallory's fingers tightened slightly on the arms of the chair. "Yes." Gabrielle's gaze darkened. "Why?" Mallory's brow creased. "Because he's a respected officer." Gabrielle's tone softened. "And you trusted him?" "Yes." Gabrielle stepped closer to the stand. "Officer Mallory, have you ever seen Officer Callahan use excessive force before?" Mallory's breath hitched. Her gaze darted toward Callahan. Officer Mallory," Gabrielle said softly, "you're under oath." Mallory's throat bobbed. "Yes," she said finally. A ripple of murmurs moved through the courtroom. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. How many times? Mallory's mouth opened. Closed. 2, she whispered. Callahan's eyes flashed dangerously. Gabrielle's gaze darkened. And did you report him? Mallory's face flushed. I couldn't. Why not? Mallory's hands curled into fists in her lap. Because he's protected. By who? Mallory's gaze darted toward Chief Conrad, who sat stiffly in the gallery. Gabrielle's gaze hardened. Who protects him? Mallory's throat tightened. Her gaze slid toward Callahan. Chief Conrad. The gallery erupted into whispers. Callahan's face twisted into a scowl. He shot Mallory a look sharp enough to cut glass, but Mallory didn't meet his gaze. Gabrielle's eyes narrowed. You knew. Mallory nodded. And you were afraid? Mallory's breath hitched. Yes. Gabrielle turned toward the jury. 12 complaints, she said coldly. 12 complaints of excessive force. And none of them were investigated because they were buried by the man leading the department. Judge Holloway's gavel struck wood. Order. Gabrielle's gaze slid toward Callahan. His expression was dark with fury. Gabrielle smiled faintly. No further questions. She returned to her seat. Ethan leaned toward her, his eyes sharp with disbelief. You're going after the police chief? Gabrielle's gaze stayed fixed on Callahan. Not yet, she murmured. But soon. Callahan's gaze darkened. His hand curled into a fist on the table. He knew the walls were closing in, and Gabrielle Monroe was about to deliver the final blow. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. Officer Heather Mallory's final words still hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Chief Conrad's name had been spoken aloud, and there was no way to take it back. Gabrielle sat perfectly still at the defense table, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Her expression was smooth, unyielding. But beneath the surface, she could feel the delicate shift of power, a subtle but undeniable crack in the foundation beneath Officer Callahan's feet. Across the aisle, Callahan's expression had sharpened into something predatory. His smirk was gone, replaced by a calculating coldness. His jaw flexed as he sat rigidly in his seat, hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was losing control, and he knew it. Gabrielle's lips curled faintly. Good. Chief Conrad sat behind Callahan in the gallery, his face carved from stone. His uniform was immaculate, his expression betraying nothing, but his eyes were dark with quiet rage. He had underestimated her. They all had. Judge Holloway's gavel struck the wood. Order, the judge said, her tone sharp. Her gaze swept across the courtroom, lingering on Callahan before shifting toward the prosecution's table. Prosecution, your next witness? Assistant District Attorney Rourke stood. He adjusted his tie, his expression carefully neutral. But Gabrielle could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth. He was scrambling. The prosecution rests, Your Honor, Rourke said, his voice strained. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Gabrielle's eyes narrowed. Cowards! Rourke was trying to hold the line, trying to prevent the case from unraveling completely. By resting early, he was hoping to keep Gabrielle from driving the knife any deeper. But it was too late for that. Gabrielle rose smoothly to her feet. Defense would like to call Chief Matthew Conrad to the stand. Chief Conrad's jaw tightened. His gaze slid toward Gabrielle, cold and assessing. Objection, Rourke snapped. This is irrelevant to the charges at hand. Judge Holloway's eyes sharpened. Overruled. Conrad's expression didn't change. He rose slowly from his seat, adjusting the silver buttons on his uniform as he approached the stand. He swore in, his gaze steady. Gabrielle approached the stand, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She stopped directly in front of Conrad, her gaze level. Chief Conrad, Gabrielle said, her voice smooth. How long have you served with the Lincoln Police Department? 24 years. Gabrielle tilted her head slightly. Impressive. Conrad's gaze remained hard and unreadable. Thank you. In those 24 years, Gabrielle continued, you've undoubtedly encountered a number of disciplinary issues within the department. Correct. Of course. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. How many excessive force complaints have been filed under your leadership? Conrad's jaw flexed. I don't have that number available. I do, Gabrielle replied calmly. She held up a manila folder. Conrad's gaze darkened. 27 complaints in the last 5 years, Gabrielle said. 12 of those involving Officer Callahan. Murmurs stirred through the gallery. And how many of those complaints were investigated? Gabrielle pressed. Conrad's expression didn't shift. All of them were reviewed. Reviewed, Gabrielle repeated softly. But not investigated. Conrad's jaw twitched. Gabrielle's tone sharpened. Do you stand by your decision not to investigate? I stand by my officers. Gabrielle stepped closer. Even when they're wrong? Conrad's gaze darkened. My officers are trained professionals. So that's a yes? Conrad's mouth tightened. Gabrielle smiled faintly. Tell me, Chief Conrad, are you aware that Officer Callahan's body camera malfunctioned 12 times in the last 3 years? Conrad's gaze flicked toward Callahan. That's a statistical anomaly, wouldn't you say? Gabrielle continued. Conrad's eyes narrowed. Equipment malfunctions happen. Gabrielle stepped closer. 12 times. Conrad didn't respond. Gabrielle's smile sharpened. And how many of those incidents involved black suspects? Conrad's jaw flexed. Gabrielle's eyes darkened. All of them. The room was dead silent. Gabrielle's tone softened, becoming almost dangerous. Chief Conrad, do you believe Officer Callahan was justified in arresting me? Conrad's gaze slid toward Callahan, a flicker of something dangerous passing between them. Yes. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. Even though there was no weapon, no threat, Conrad's jaw tensed. Yes. Gabrielle smiled faintly. Interesting. She turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Exhibit C. Ethan stood from the defense table and handed her a USB drive. Exhibit C, Gabrielle said, is a recording taken from a hidden surveillance camera located across from the warehouse where I was arrested. Conrad's face sharpened. Callahan sat up straighter, his jaw clenching. Rourke shot to his feet. Objection. On what grounds? Judge Holloway asked. It's inadmissible. Overruled, the judge said crisply. Play the recording. A bailiff inserted the USB into the courtroom's media system. The screen flickered to life. The video was grainy but clear enough. It showed Gabrielle standing beneath a street lamp. Callahan approached her, his posture aggressive. There was no audio, but the body language was unmistakable. Gabrielle raised her hands, palms open, defensive. Callahan grabbed her arm. Gabrielle flinched. Callahan shoved her against the hood of the patrol car. She didn't fight back. She didn't reach for his weapon. She stood perfectly still. The courtroom was deathly silent. The video ended. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. Chief Conrad, does that look like an aggressive suspect to you? Conrad's lips pressed into a thin line. Gabrielle's tone sharpened. Yes or no? No. And yet you supported Officer Callahan's report? Conrad's gaze darkened. Yes. Gabrielle's voice dropped. Why? Conrad's jaw flexed. Because he's my officer. Gabrielle's smile sharpened. And that's the problem. She turned toward the jury. Systemic protection. Systemic corruption. Gabrielle's gaze swept over the gallery. It's not about accountability. It's about shielding those in power, even when they're wrong. Conrad's gaze darkened. No further questions, Gabrielle said softly. She turned and walked back to the defense table. Conrad stood from the stand. His gaze slid toward Callahan as he passed him. Callahan's face was white with quiet rage. Gabrielle sat down. Ethan leaned toward her. That was, he exhaled. Bold. Gabrielle smiled faintly. We're not done. Judge Holloway's gavel struck the wood. We'll recess until tomorrow, the judge said. Court adjourned. Gabrielle rose, smoothing the front of her jacket. Her gaze slid toward Callahan, who stood at the prosecution's table, his hands curled into fists. His carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse, and Gabrielle Monroe was holding the hammer. The Lincoln County Courthouse was a pressure cooker. By the time Gabrielle Monroe arrived that morning, the crowd outside had tripled in size. Reporters with microphones and cameras stood behind metal barricades, calling out questions as she approached the main entrance. Ms. Monroe, Gabrielle, do you have a statement? Are you accusing the Lincoln Police Department of a cover-up? Gabrielle's heels clicked steadily against the stone steps as she ascended toward the courthouse doors. A black overcoat hung from her shoulders, her tailored navy suit crisp beneath it. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe bun. Ethan Powell walked just behind her, his expression tense. "You sure about this?" he asked under his breath. "Yes. They'll come after you," Ethan said. "Callahan, Conrad, you're threatening to bring down half the department." Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "That's the plan." Gabrielle reached the top of the steps and turned toward the reporters. The noise surged. Gabrielle raised her hand, and silence fell. "I know many of you have questions," Gabrielle said, her voice steady and measured. "I'll address them soon. But first, I have a trial to finish." She turned and disappeared into the courthouse. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was taken. Spectators leaned forward, elbows on their knees. Reporters lined the back wall, notepads ready. The jury sat stiffly, expressions guarded. Officer Brian Callahan sat at the prosecution's table. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, but the tension in his jaw and the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed him. Chief Conrad sat directly behind him in the gallery. His expression was carved from stone. Judge Holloway entered the courtroom and settled into her chair. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Gabrielle stood from the defense table, smoothing her jacket. Ethan adjusted his tie beside her. When the judge nodded, Gabrielle stepped toward the center of the room. "Your Honor," Gabrielle said, "the defense would like to call Officer Brian Callahan to the stand." The tension in the room coiled tight. Callahan's jaw twitched. Slowly, he rose from his chair. His movements were stiff, controlled, as he walked toward the stand. He swore in, his gaze cold and hard as he settled into the chair. Gabrielle approached him slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Officer Callahan," Gabrielle began, her voice smooth as glass, "you've already testified that you arrested me for resisting arrest and attempting to assault you." "Correct." "Yes." Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "Even though the surveillance footage clearly shows that I neither resisted nor attacked you." Callahan's eyes darkened. "Footage can be manipulated." Gabrielle smiled faintly. "And yet, the footage aligns with the testimonies of multiple witnesses, including your fellow officer, Heather Mallory." Callahan's jaw flexed. Gabrielle's gaze hardened. "You lied," she said softly. Callahan's gaze sharpened. "No, you fabricated evidence." "No, you falsified your report." "No." Gabrielle's smile sharpened. "Then explain why the body cam footage from that night mysteriously disappeared." Callahan's mouth twitched. "It malfunctioned. 12 times." "Yes." Gabrielle stepped closer. "And you expect the court to believe that?" Callahan's gaze narrowed dangerously. "Yes." Gabrielle smiled faintly. "I don't," she said. She turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gabrielle said, "you've heard the testimonies. You've seen the footage. Officer Callahan claimed I was aggressive, that I assaulted him, but you saw the truth." Her gaze sharpened. "I wasn't aggressive. I wasn't violent. I was targeted." Gabrielle's eyes narrowed toward Callahan. "And now we know why." Gabrielle turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," Gabrielle said, "the defense would like to introduce Exhibit D." Ethan stood and handed her a folder. "This," Gabrielle said, holding up a thin stack of papers, "is a series of internal emails obtained under subpoena between Officer Callahan and Chief Conrad." The gallery erupted into murmurs. Judge Holloway's brow lifted. Gabrielle walked toward the bailiff, who handed the folder to the judge. Gabrielle turned toward Callahan. "Would you like to explain these?" Callahan's face paled. "You conspired with Chief Conrad," Gabrielle said, her voice cold. "He instructed you to target me." "What?" Callahan's gaze hardened. His mouth curled into a bitter smile. "You already know why," he said. "Tell the court." Callahan's gaze slid toward Chief Conrad, who sat rigidly behind him in the gallery. For a moment, Callahan's jaw flexed. His gaze darkened. "Because you're a problem," Callahan said. His voice was low and dangerous. "You've been a problem since the day you walked into this town." Gabrielle's expression remained calm. "Because I questioned you?" Callahan's smile was thin and razor-sharp. "Because you're black," he said. And because you thought you were untouchable. The gallery exploded. Gasps and murmurs surged through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing. Judge Holloway's gavel struck Witch sharply. Order. Gabrielle's gaze didn't waver. Thank you, she said softly. She turned toward the jury. There it is, Gabrielle said. The truth. Officer Callahan arrested me. Not because I was a threat, but because I had the audacity to question his authority. Gabrielle's tone sharpened. This isn't about one bad cop. This is about a system designed to protect men like him. Men who believe that a badge gives them the right to target, to intimidate, to violate the very laws they swore to uphold. Gabrielle's gaze swept toward Chief Conrad, and it's about the people in power who shield them. Chief Conrad's jaw tightened. Gabrielle stepped back. No further questions. Gabrielle walked back toward the defense table and sat down. Ethan leaned toward her, his gaze bright with disbelief. You just made him confess, Ethan whispered. Gabrielle's gaze didn't leave Callahan, who sat at the stand, his hands curled into fists. I know, Gabrielle said quietly. 30 minutes later, the jury returned. Gabrielle stood beside Ethan at the defense table as the foreman stood and handed a folded slip of paper to the bailiff. Judge Holloway unfolded the paper and read it silently. She lifted her gaze toward the courtroom. On the charges of resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer, the judge said, "We find the defendant not guilty." The gallery erupted into chaos. Callahan's face twisted into rage. His mouth opened. And furthermore, Judge Holloway said over the noise, "This court recommends that criminal charges be filed against Officer Brian Callahan for misconduct, falsifying reports, and obstruction of justice." Callahan's face drained of color. Bailiffs moved toward him. "You can't do this," Callahan hissed. Gabrielle stepped toward him, her gaze like ice. "You thought you were untouchable," she said. Callahan's gaze darkened. Gabrielle's voice dropped. "You were wrong." The bailiffs took Callahan's arms and led him toward the side door. His gaze never left Gabrielle's. But Gabrielle stood still, her posture straight and her gaze calm. He was finished. Gabrielle turned toward the gallery. Chief Conrad had already disappeared. Coward. Gabrielle smiled faintly. Victory tasted cold, but clean. She turned toward Ethan. "It's over," Ethan said. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "No," she said softly. "This is just the beginning." The Lincoln County Courthouse was a pressure cooker. By the time Gabrielle Monroe arrived that morning, the crowd outside had tripled in size. Reporters with microphones and cameras stood behind metal barricades, calling out questions as she approached the main entrance. "Ms. Monroe, Gabrielle, do you have a statement? Are you accusing the Lincoln Police Department of a cover-up?" Gabrielle's heels clicked steadily against the stone steps as she ascended toward the courthouse doors. A black overcoat hung from her shoulders, her tailored navy suit crisp beneath it. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe bun. Ethan Powell walked just behind her, his expression tense. "You sure about this?" he asked under his breath. "Yes. They'll come after you," Ethan said. "Callahan, Conrad, you're threatening to bring down half the department." Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "That's the plan." Gabrielle reached the top of the steps and turned toward the reporters. The noise surged. Gabrielle raised her hand, and silence fell. "I know many of you have questions," Gabrielle said, her voice steady and measured. "I'll address them soon. But first, I have a trial to finish." She turned and disappeared into the courthouse. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was taken. Spectators leaned forward, elbows on their knees. Reporters lined the back wall, notepads ready. The jury sat stiffly, expressions guarded. Officer Brian Callahan sat at the prosecution's table. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, but the tension in his jaw and the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed him. Chief Conrad sat directly behind him in the gallery. His expression was carved from stone. Judge Holloway entered the courtroom and settled into her chair. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Gabrielle stood from the defense table, smoothing her jacket. Ethan adjusted his tie beside her. When the judge nodded, Gabrielle stepped toward the center of the room. "Your Honor," Gabrielle said. The defense would like to call Officer Brian Callahan to the stand. The tension in the room coiled tight. Callahan's jaw twitched. Slowly, he rose from his chair. His movements were stiff, controlled, as he walked toward the stand. He swore in, his gaze cold and hard as he settled into the chair. Gabrielle approached him slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Officer Callahan, Gabrielle began, her voice smooth as glass. You've already testified that you arrested me for resisting arrest and attempting to assault you. Correct. Yes. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. Even though the surveillance footage clearly shows that I neither resisted nor attacked you. Callahan's eyes darkened. Footage can be manipulated. Gabrielle smiled faintly. And yet, the footage aligns with the testimonies of multiple witnesses, including your fellow officer, Heather Mallory. Callahan's jaw flexed. Gabrielle's gaze hardened. You lied, she said softly. Callahan's gaze sharpened. No, you fabricated evidence. No, you falsified your report. No. Gabrielle's smile sharpened. Then explain why the body cam footage from that night mysteriously disappeared. Callahan's mouth twitched. It malfunctioned. 12 times. Yes. Gabrielle stepped closer. And you expect the court to believe that? Callahan's gaze narrowed dangerously. Yes. Gabrielle smiled faintly. I don't, she said. She turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Gabrielle said, you've heard the testimonies. You've seen the footage. Officer Callahan claimed I was aggressive, that I assaulted him, but you saw the truth. Her gaze sharpened. I wasn't aggressive. I wasn't violent. I was targeted. Gabrielle's eyes narrowed toward Callahan. And now we know why. Gabrielle turned toward the judge. Your Honor, Gabrielle said, the defense would like to introduce Exhibit D. Ethan stood and handed her a folder. This, Gabrielle said, holding up a thin stack of papers, is a series of internal emails obtained under subpoena between Officer Callahan and Chief Conrad. The gallery erupted into murmurs. Judge Holloway's brow lifted. Gabrielle walked toward the bailiff, who handed the folder to the judge. Gabrielle turned toward Callahan. Would you like to explain these? Callahan's face paled. You conspired with Chief Conrad, Gabrielle said, her voice cold. He instructed you to target me. What? Callahan's gaze hardened. His mouth curled into a bitter smile. You already know why, he said. Tell the court. Callahan's gaze slid toward Chief Conrad, who sat rigidly behind him in the gallery. For a moment, Callahan's jaw flexed. His gaze darkened. Because you're a problem, Callahan said. His voice was low and dangerous. You've been a problem since the day you walked into this town. Gabrielle's expression remained calm. Because I questioned you? Callahan's smile was thin and razor-sharp. Because you're black, he said, and because you thought you were untouchable. The gallery exploded. Gasps and murmurs surged through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing. Judge Holloway's gavel struck Wood sharply. Order. Gabrielle's gaze didn't waver. Thank you, she said softly. She turned toward the jury. There it is, Gabrielle said. The truth. Officer Callahan arrested me. Not because I was a threat, but because I had the audacity to question his authority. Gabrielle's tone sharpened. This isn't about one bad cop. This is about a system designed to protect men like him. Men who believe that a badge gives them the right to target, to intimidate, to violate the very laws they swore to uphold. Gabrielle's gaze swept toward Chief Conrad, and it's about the people in power who shield them. Chief Conrad's jaw tightened. Gabrielle stepped back. No further questions. Gabrielle walked back toward the defense table and sat down. Ethan leaned toward her, his gaze bright with disbelief. You just made him confess, Ethan whispered. Gabrielle's gaze didn't leave Callahan, who sat at the stand, his hands curled into fists. I know, Gabrielle said quietly. 30 minutes later, the jury returned. Gabrielle stood beside Ethan at the defense table as the foreman stood and handed a folded slip of paper to the bailiff. Judge Holloway unfolded the paper and read it silently. She lifted her gaze toward the courtroom. On the charges of resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer, The judge said, "We find the defendant not guilty." The gallery erupted into chaos. Callahan's face twisted into rage. His mouth opened. And furthermore, Judge Holloway said over the noise, "This court recommends that criminal charges be filed against Officer Brian Callahan for misconduct, falsifying reports, and obstruction of justice." Callahan's face drained of color. Bailiffs moved toward him. "You can't do this," Callahan hissed. Gabrielle stepped toward him, her gaze like ice. "You thought you were untouchable," she said. Callahan's gaze darkened. Gabrielle's voice dropped. "You were wrong." The bailiffs took Callahan's arms and led him toward the side door. His gaze never left Gabrielle's. But Gabrielle stood still, her posture straight and her gaze calm. He was finished. Gabrielle turned toward the gallery. Chief Conrad had already disappeared. "Coward." Gabrielle smiled faintly. Victory tasted cold, but clean. She turned toward Ethan. "It's over," Ethan said. Gabrielle's gaze sharpened. "No," she said softly. "This is just the beginning."